The color of shadows. It was a stormy night when Ethan Barnes sat alone in his small, dimly lit studio. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the cracks of the old building. He had spent the past 5 years of his life painting, capturing the world in vibrant splashes of color. His art had once been celebrated in galleries around the city, but now he found himself disillusioned. The fame, the praise, none of it brought him peace. It was as if the colors he used to create had begun to lose their meaning, fading into the emptiness of his soul. He wanted more. He needed something deeper, something real. A shift. It was then that the idea came to him to take his art beyond the walls of galleries, to share it with those who needed it most. What better way to use his talent than to bring joy to the sick and the suffering? He would paint murals in hospitals, schools, orphanages. He would use his brush to fill the world with color, to bring hope to those whose lives had been overshadowed by illness, fear, or despair. The thought of giving something meaningful, something lasting, stirred something deep inside him. Perhaps this would be his way out of the darkness. And so, the next day, Ethan reached out to the local hospital, offering to paint murals in their pediatric ward. They were more than happy to accept, and within days, Ethan found himself standing before a blank wall, staring at the cold, white surface that stretched before him. It was then that he felt the weight of the task he had taken on. This was no longer just about his art. It was about bringing light into the lives of others, about creating something that would outlast him. Ethan began his work, pouring his soul into every stroke of the brush. The once lifeless room gradually transformed, blossoming with vibrant colors and whimsical designs. His murals depicted lush gardens, vibrant sunsets, and majestic animals. He painted children playing in fields of flowers, their faces beaming with joy, their bodies dancing in the warmth of the sun. But with each new layer of paint, a strange feeling began to creep over him, a feeling that something was watching him, something unseen. At first, he brushed it aside, focusing on his work, but the sensation persisted, growing stronger each day. Then, one evening, as he worked late into the night, something happened. As his brush touched the wall, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He spun around, but the room was empty. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. His heart began to race. Had he imagined it? Was he just exhausted? He couldn't say for certain, but there was no denying the unsettling feeling that gnawed at him. The next day, as he continued painting, he noticed something odd. The figures in his murals seemed to change, ever so slightly, when he wasn't looking directly at them. A child's smile would fade, a tree would lose a branch, and the colors would darken, almost imperceptibly. It was as if the murals were alive, shifting, changing in ways he couldn't explain. Panic crept in. What was happening to his art? Why was this happening? Was it his mind playing tricks on him, or was there something more sinister at work? As the days passed, Ethan found himself growing more and more obsessed with the murals. He couldn't stop painting, couldn't stop adding to the scenes, even though they seemed to be taking on a life of their own. The sense of unease intensified, and yet, he couldn't tear himself away. The hospital staff and patients marveled at his work, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was watching him from the shadows, from the edges of the painted world he had created. One evening, after another long day of painting, Ethan returned to his apartment, his mind swirling with doubt and fear. He collapsed into his chair, his hands trembling as he looked at the photographs of his past work. The once vibrant, hopeful scenes now seemed hollow, empty. He couldn't escape the feeling that his art was no longer his own. It was as if something darker had taken hold of it, something that was influencing his every move. The next morning, he visited the hospital to check on his progress. The walls he had painted were still stunning, filled with life and color. But as he walked down the hallway, he noticed something unsettling. The air felt thick, oppressive. The light seemed to dim the further he went down the corridor. When he reached the pediatric ward, he was greeted by the staff, but their expressions were strange. Forced smiles, eyes too wide, too knowing. Ethan's heart skipped a beat when he stepped into the room where he had painted the largest mural. The children, who had once been delighted by the vibrant scene of a magical forest, were now silent. They stared at the mural, their eyes vacant, their faces devoid of emotion. Ethan approached, his breath caught in his throat.
The scene had changed.
The forest was no longer bright and cheerful. The trees were twisted, their branches clawing at the sky. The animals, once playful and friendly, now seemed grotesque, their eyes wild with terror. It was as if the mural had taken on a life of its own, a life that was no longer about hope, but about fear. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. "It's coming for you, Ethan." The words were soft, almost a whisper, but they sent a chill down his spine. He turned to see a young girl sitting in the corner of the room, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her hands trembled as she clutched a stuffed animal to her chest. "The shadow," she whispered again. "It's coming." Ethan stepped forward, his heart racing. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The shadow in the painting," the girl said, her voice shaking. "It's in all the paintings, but it's in yours the most. It's growing, Ethan. It's waiting for you." Ethan stared at the girl, his mind spinning. The shadow.
He had seen it, he realized.
It was in the corners of his murals, lurking just beyond the edges of the vibrant colors, just beyond the frame of his vision. It was always there, watching, waiting. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and fear. Ethan couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The shadow seemed to follow him everywhere, creeping into every corner of his life. The murals, once his passion, now felt like a curse, a trap he couldn't escape. The more he painted, the stronger the shadow became, and with each passing day, it began to take form. A dark figure, shrouded in mystery, with eyes that gleamed like black holes, pulling him into an abyss he couldn't comprehend. One evening, as he sat before the largest mural he had ever created, the shadow reached out. Ethan could feel it, could see it now, moving within the canvas, stretching its dark tendrils toward him. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the surface of the painting. In an instant, he was pulled inside, his body sucked into the painted world, his mind overwhelmed by the darkness. He fell through endless shadows, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. He could hear whispers, soft voices calling his name. He looked around, but all he saw was the void, a world without light, without color. Then, in the distance, he saw something, a flicker of light, a small, shining figure. It was a child, standing in the middle of the void, their back to him. "Come," the child said. "You have to come. It's the only way out." Ethan stumbled toward the child, desperate for answers, for a way to escape the nightmare that had become his life. As he reached the child, they turned to face him, their face glowing with an ethereal light. But it was not a face he recognized. It was a face he had painted countless times, a face that had appeared in his murals, in his dreams. The child was him, or rather, a version of him, a shadow of who he had once been. The child smiled. "You painted your own prison, Ethan," they said softly. "You painted the darkness, and now it has you. But you can break free. You just have to let go." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Let go? How could he? His art had been his life, his salvation. How could he give it up? The child reached out, touching Ethan's hand. "It's not the art that matters, Ethan. It's the light,
The joy.
the love. That's what you need to find, not the darkness." And with that, Ethan felt the weight of the shadows lift. The darkness began to fade, the oppressive weight of fear and doubt slipping away. He was back in the hospital, standing before the mural once again, the room now bathed in light. The mural had changed, too. The colors were bright once more, the figures smiling, the animals playful. Ethan stepped back, his heart full of peace. He had learned a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Art was not about creating something that trapped him in darkness. It was about creating something that could bring light to others, something that could inspire, heal, and bring hope. He had found the balance, the purpose he had been searching for. As he walked out of the hospital, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. The shadow was gone. The murals, now filled with color and life, were a reflection of the journey he had taken from darkness to light, from fear to hope. And he knew that, no matter what happened, he would continue to paint. But this time, it would be with a heart full of love, a heart full of light, because that, he realized, was the true meaning of art.
Whispering echoes.